Camila, she's staying. You're leaving. The words didn't register at first. They were just sounds hanging in the air above the white linen tablecloth, suspended somewhere between the flickering candle and the single, perfect rose in its crystal vase. My husband, Richard, didn't look at me when he said them. His focus was entirely on the delicate, almost surgical act of pouring a $5,000 bottle of Chateau Margaux into a glass that wasn't mine. The wine, the color of a deep sunset, glugged softly into the crystal, a sound that was suddenly louder than the entire city of New York outside the panoramic window. The glass belonged to a girl young enough to be my granddaughter, sitting in my chair at my table, on the evening of my 50th wedding anniversary. Her name was Amber, and the small glowing rectangle in her hand, propped up by a salt shaker, was broadcasting this moment live to the world on TikTok. I watched Richard's hand, the one that had held mine at the altar 50 years ago. The skin was tanned and spotted with age, but the movement was steady, confident. He finished pouring, setting the bottle down with a reverence he hadn't shown me in years. He smiled at her, a full, genuine smile that reached his eyes, crinkling the corners in a way that I once found endearing. Now it was a weapon. "There you are, my love," he said, his voice a low, intimate rumble. Amber giggled. It was a high, tinkling sound like cheap wind chimes. She picked up her glass, her long acrylic nails clicking against it. "Thanks, Richie Bear." She didn't taste the wine. She held it up, turning the glass so the light from the chandeliers fractured through the expensive liquid, preening for her phone. I could see the little red hearts and thumbs-up icons floating up the side of her screen. An invisible audience was applauding my execution. The restaurant, per se, a place where reservations were a status symbol, and the silence was as curated as the food, had fallen quiet. Not a sudden dramatic hush, but a slow draining of sound, like water seeping into sand. The murmur of conversation at the surrounding tables faded. The clinking of cutlery stopped. I could feel the weight of dozens of pairs of eyes on me, a physical pressure on my skin. I was no longer a diner, I was a spectacle. A car crash in a couture gown. I finally looked down at my own plate. The untouched amuse-bouche, a single oyster with a pearl of caviar, looked obscene. A luxury I couldn't swallow. My throat had closed up, a tight, painful knot of disbelief. 50 years. We had built a life, an empire, 2 children for grandchildren. We had weathered storms, celebrated triumphs. This morning he had kissed me, his lips brushing my cheek, and handed me a velvet box containing the diamond earrings I was now wearing. "To 50 more, my love," the card had read. Had that man been a ghost? Or was this man, this stranger sitting across from me, the ghost? The one who had been haunting my marriage all along? Richard finally turned his gaze to me. His eyes were flat, a placid gray like a winter lake frozen over. There was no anger, no sadness. Just a chilling businesslike finality. He slid something across the table. It skidded on the smooth linen and stopped just short of my bread plate. A black American Express card. His name was embossed on it in silver. Richard Sterling. "Take this," he said, his voice clipped, efficient. The voice he used with underlings. "Call an Uber. Get yourself a room for the night. The Four Seasons, the Plaza, I don't care. Your things will be in storage by morning. Your things. Not our things. My life, my clothes, my books, the photographs of our children, the rocking chair where I nursed them, all of it relegated to a single dismissive phrase. Your things. Boxed up. Sent away. Erased." A wave of nausea washed over me. The air in the room felt thick, heavy, impossible to breathe. I wanted to scream. I wanted to stand up and flip the table, to shatter the expensive wine glasses and watch that $5,000 wine bleed all over the pristine white cloth. I wanted to claw at the smiling, vacant face of the girl who was filming my soul being ripped out. But I did nothing. My body was encased in ice. My limbs were leaden, my tongue a dry, useless thing in my mouth. Shock is a strange mercy. It numbs the wound before the pain can kill you. Amber giggled again, louder this time. The sound pierced through my paralysis. "Oh my God, Richie, you're so savage," she cooed, and then her attention swiveled back to me. She picked up her phone, her movements sharp and predatory. The lens was now pointed directly at my face. "Gotta get a good shot for the fans," she said, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. Her thumb tapped the screen. A digital effect shimmered into existence. Suddenly on her phone's display my face was distorted. 2 cartoonish red horns sprouted from my temples. My mouth was twisted into a grotesque drooling snarl. A fly rendered in cheap CGI buzzed around my head. The filter was called Old Hag. I could see the comments exploding on her screen now. A torrent of laughing emojis, skulls, knife icons. LMAO. Get rid of the Crypt Keeper. OMG, he upgraded. Yes, Queen Amber, take the throne. Her face, LMAO. Each comment was a small sharp stone hitting me. I was 70 years old. I had raised a family, managed a household that ran with the precision of a corporate headquarters, and stood by this man's side as he built his tech empire from a garage startup into a global behemoth. I had been his partner, his confidant, his social architect. And in the space of a single glass of wine, I had been reduced to a meme, a joke, an old hag with digital horns. Richard saw it. He leaned over, glanced at her screen and chuckled. A low appreciative sound. He was proud of her. Proud of this cruelty. It was a performance and I was the prop. His final grand gesture to prove his vitality, his power. He wasn't just acquiring a new woman. He was publicly destroying the old one. My hands were trembling in my lap, so I clasped them together, digging my fingernails into my palms to feel something, anything other than the cold, creeping numbness. I focused on a single point, the small, almost invisible mend in the tablecloth to the left of my fork. I had noticed it when we sat down, a tiny imperfection in a world of curated perfection. Now it felt like a kindred spirit. Something trying to hold itself together against the odds. Well, Richard's voice cut through my thoughts, impatient. Are you going to sit there all night? You're ruining the mood. The mood? He spoke as if I had committed a social faux pas, like using the wrong fork for the fish course. The sheer breathtaking arrogance of it finally cracked the ice around my heart. A shard of pure hot rage pierced through the shock. I slowly raised my head and met his eyes. I let him see the ruin he had made. I didn't speak. I didn't cry. I just looked at him, forcing him to witness the silent detonation of a 50-year life. For a fleeting second I thought I saw something flicker in his gaze, a shadow of the man I married, a ghost of a conscience. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a wall of indifference. He had already moved on. I was a chapter he had finished reading, and he was closing the book. The waiter, a young man with a pale, horrified face, hovered nearby, frozen in professional indecision. He didn't know whether to clear my plate or call an ambulance. I drew a breath. It was a ragged, shallow thing. I looked from Richard's cold face to Amber's triumphant smirk, to the glowing phone that was my public stocks. I saw the averted eyes of the other patrons, the whispers behind elegantly raised hands. I was alone, utterly and completely alone, in a room full of people. My gaze fell back to the black card on the table. It was my only lifeline and it was a leash, an instrument of my dismissal. He wasn't just kicking me out. He was paying for my exit, turning my departure into one last transaction. My worth, my 50 years, calculated and settled with a piece of plastic. With a slowness that felt deliberate, almost defiant, I reached out my hand. My fingers, wrinkled and adorned with the wedding ring he had placed on them half a century ago, trembled as they closed around the card. It felt cold and foreign in my palm, a key to a life I didn't want, and a final undeniable sign that the life I had known was over. I stood up. My knees felt weak, unsteady. The diamond earrings he gave me this morning felt impossibly heavy, pulling at my earlobes. I didn't look at him again. I didn't look at her. I turned my back on the table, on the uneaten meal, on the $5,000 wine, on the 50 years of memories that now felt like a lie. As I walked away, my steps measured and brittle, I could hear Amber's voice, bright and chirpy, narrating my retreat for her audience. And there she goes, guys. The old ball and chain is officially gone. Let the real party begin. Her followers cheered with a cascade of digital hearts. The sound of their silent, joyous applause followed me all the way out of the restaurant and into the cold, indifferent night. My name is Camilla Sterling. I am 70 years old. For 50 of those years I was what the world called a perfect wife. The elegant, silent partner to a titan of technology, Richard Sterling. My life was a carefully curated masterpiece of domesticity and social grace. I raised our 2 children, Michael and Elena, not just feeding and clothing them, but molding them into the kind of adults who could navigate the gilded cages of their father's world. I was the one who taught them empathy, a currency their father never traded in. I was there for the scraped knees, the midnight fevers, the broken hearts, and the triumphant college acceptance letters. Each of their successes felt like a line item on the balance sheet of my own life, a quiet dividend on my investment of love. I managed our 5 properties, which is a sterile way of saying I breathed life into empty houses. Our Manhattan penthouse wasn't just a collection of rooms with a view. It was a sanctuary above the city's chaos, a place where the scent of my lemon and rosemary chicken could make even Richard forget the stock market for an hour. Our estate in the Hamptons wasn't a status symbol. It was the keeper of our summers, a house that smelled of salt air, wet sand, and the hydrangeas I nurtured with my own hands. I knew the name of every gardener, every housekeeper, every contractor. They weren't just staff to me. They were the people who helped me weave the fabric of our family's memories. I orchestrated our lives with the precision of a general and the heart of a mother. I was the architect of Richard's social ascent. The galas I hosted weren't just parties. They were strategic operations. I spent weeks planning the seating charts, knowing that placing the right venture capitalist next to the right startup founder could be more valuable than any boardroom meeting. I chose the menus, the wine, the music, the lighting, every detail designed to project an image of effortless power and impeccable taste. An image that landed us on the cover of magazines. I would move through those glittering rooms, a ghost in a couture gown, my smile serene, ensuring every glass was filled, every conversation sparked, while Richard stood in the center of the room, soaking in the credit for the world I had built around him. I was his most valuable accessory, the quiet, graceful counterpoint to his bombastic genius. He built an empire of code and silicon. I built a home of warmth and memory. For half a century, I let him believe one was worth infinitely more than the other. I allowed him to think that his world of numbers and profits was the real world, and mine was just a pleasant fiction he came home to. That was my first and most profound mistake. A home, an empire, a life, they all need a foundation. And the foundation of the life Richard Sterling so proudly stood upon was not his alone. It was built with the pieces of a different life, my life, a life I had willingly given away. Before I was Mrs. Sterling, the domestic manager, as he would later call me in a dismissive interview, I was Camila Reyes. And Camila Reyes was a forensic accountant. I loved the clean, irrefutable logic of numbers. I found poetry in a balanced ledger. And I had a rare talent for finding the lies that people tried to hide within them. Numbers never lied, they only told stories, and I was an expert translator of their language. My career was just beginning to take flight. I had a mind that saw patterns others missed, an instinct for the flaw in a perfect-looking financial statement. I felt a sense of power in it, a quiet confidence that I could uncover the truth, no matter how deeply it was buried. Then I met Richard. He was brilliant, yes, but more than that, he was a storm of ambition. He had an idea, a revolutionary piece of software, but no capital. He spoke of the future with such certainty, such burning passion, that it was impossible not to be swept up in his orbit. He promised we were a team, that his dream was our dream. And I believed him. I believed him with every fiber of my being. My father, a federal judge who had seen the best and worst of human nature, had left me a modest but crucial inheritance. It was his life savings, a testament to a career of quiet integrity. It was meant to be my safety net, my independence. But Richard saw it as his seed money. I can still see us in our tiny walk-up apartment, the plans for his first startup spread across our wobbly kitchen table. He held my hands, his eyes electric with vision, and he asked me to invest in him. In us. He painted a future so bright, so full of promise, that my own smaller, quieter ambitions seemed selfish in comparison. So I gave it all to him. Every last dollar. I traded my career for his, my name for his, my future for the one he promised we would share. I signed the check, and in doing so, I signed away the woman I was to become, the woman he needed me to be. For the first few years, the promise held. We were a team. I used my accounting skills to manage the fledgling company's books, stretching every dollar, finding efficiencies he overlooked. My name was on the initial incorporation documents, right below his, Sterling and Reyes Tech. We worked side by side, fueled by cheap coffee and a shared dream. But as the company grew, a slow and subtle erasure began. The first time we rebranded, it became Sterling Innovations. "It's cleaner, darling," he'd said. "Better for the brand." I didn't argue. I was pregnant with Michael at the time, and the world of motherhood was already beginning to consume me. Seemed like such a small thing. Then my opinions, once sought after, began to be dismissed. I remember a dinner party with potential investors. I'd overheard a conversation about a potential acquisition, and drawing on my old instincts, I pointed out a significant discrepancy in their public financial reports. A red flag I thought Richard should see. He just chuckled, patted my hand, and said to the table, "Camilla worries too much. Leave the numbers to me, honey. Why don't you tell Mrs. Albright about the roses you're planting?" I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, a public and patronizing dismissal. I was no longer his partner. I was the charming hostess who grew roses. The men at the table smiled politely, their eyes glazing over as they turned back to Richard, back to the real conversation. That was the night I realized my role had been redefined without my consent. The final demotion came in the form of a single devastating phrase. We were being profiled for a major business magazine. The journalist, a sharp young woman, asked me what my official role in Richard's success had been. Before I could answer, Richard laughed, a big booming sound that filled the room. "She's the CEO of the Sterling household," he declared. "The best domestic manager a man could ask for." He said it with a proud smile, as if it were a grand compliment. The journalist wrote it down. And there it was, in print for the whole world to see. 50 years of sacrifice, of intellectual contribution, of emotional labor, all reduced to domestic manager. It wasn't a slip of the tongue. It was the truth of how he saw me. I wasn't the foundation. I was the furniture. And as I would soon learn, furniture is easily replaced. IT didn't begin with a bang, but with 1,000 tiny paper-thin cuts, each one so small you could almost convince yourself it hadn't happened. The cruelty was an insidious creep, a change in the atmospheric pressure of our home. It started with his words, little barbs disguised as jokes. We were on a quarterly video conference with his board, a call I used to sit in on as a silent partner. Now I was just the woman who brought him his coffee. As I set the mug on his desk, he gestured to my face on the screen, a wide, performative grin stretching his lips. "And here's my lovely wife, Camilla," he announced to the dozen faces in their digital boxes. "She's aging like a fine wine. That's been left out in the sun a little too long." A few of the younger board members chuckled nervously. He laughed, a booming sound that filled the office, and I just stood there, the heat rising in my cheeks, a ghost in my own home, my wrinkles suddenly feeling like deep, shameful canyons under the harsh office lighting. I retreated, his laughter echoing behind me, and realized I was no longer a partner but a prop. The gifts became another weapon. For my 70th birthday, he presented me with a small, neat box. Inside was a smartwatch, the kind you get for tracking your steps. "To keep your heart healthy, darling," he said, his smile not reaching his eyes. It was a practical, sterile, almost medical gift. A week later, I was sorting through the credit card statements, a task I still performed out of a 50-year habit, and I saw it. A charge from Cartier. Not for a watch but for a timepiece. The amount was staggering, enough to buy a small car. I felt a cold dread pool in my stomach. Later that night, while scrolling through social media, a habit I'd picked up to feel less alone, I saw her. Amber. A picture of her wrist, slender and youthful, was prominently displayed on her public profile. On it was a diamond-encrusted Rolex, glittering under the lights of some rooftop bar. The caption read, "He knows how to treat his queen. Blessed time is precious." He hadn't bought me a gift to keep me healthy. He'd bought me a tool, a utility. He'd bought her a trophy. The watch on my wrist suddenly felt heavy and insulting, a digital shackle reminding me of my new, diminished place. Then came the physical exile. It started with our bedroom, the sanctuary I had designed, from the thread count of the sheets to the exact shade of blue on the walls that was meant to be calming. One evening he came in while I was reading. He didn't sit on the bed. He stood by the door, framed like a stranger. "Camila," he said, his tone that of a CEO addressing an underperforming employee. "I need more space. To think. To create. The energy in here. It's a bit stifling." I didn't understand. Stifling? This was our room, our life. "I'm going to be sleeping in the master suite in the East Wing for a while," he continued, not waiting for a response. "I've had the staff move your things to the main guest suite in the West Wing. It has a lovely view of the gardens." He called it the main guest suite as if it were an upgrade. But we both knew what it was. It was the room we put distant relatives in, the one furthest from the heart of the house. It was an eviction notice served with a polite smile. That night I slept alone in a room that smelled of lavender potpourri, not the familiar scent of his cologne. The bed was stiff, the sheets cold. I was a guest in the life I had built. The final, daily humiliation was a masterclass in psychological warfare, carried out by the staff on his orders. It happened at dinner. He started hosting again, filling our home with young, loud people from his new ventures. I was expected to be present, the silent, dignified matriarch. But my presence was a performance of my own irrelevance. The dining table, a magnificent mahogany piece I had found in an antique shop in France decades ago, became a stage for my erasure. The staff, men and women I had known for years, who had watched my son grow up, could no longer meet my eyes. Their gazes would slide past me as if I were made of glass. When dinner was served, the plates would be set down in a precise, practiced order. First Richard at the head of the table. Then his guest of honor, usually some tech bro half his age. Then the other guests. My plate was always last. Sometimes they would forget my water glass. Or they would pour me the house red while everyone else enjoyed the vintage Bordeaux Richard had just uncorked. I never said a word. To complain would be to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. So I sat in silence eating my cold food, a ghost at my own feast. My son Michael and his wife Sarah would sometimes join these dinners. Sarah, ever the sycophant, would play along with the charade perfectly. She'd instruct their children, my grandchildren. "Now don't bother Grandma. She's tired." I wasn't tired, I was being quarantined. I would watch my grandchildren play on the far side of the lawn, their laughter like a distant melody from a life I was no longer a part of. Sarah would talk loudly about her charity committees and her new personal trainer, her voice a sharp, grating instrument in the symphony of my marginalization. Michael would just sit there, his eyes fixed on his phone, occasionally nodding at something his father said. He saw it all, the last plate, the cheap wine, the way his father called me the old woman when he thought I couldn't hear. And he did nothing. His silence was the most painful cut of all. It was an endorsement. The cruelty was in the details. One day, all the baccarat crystal glasses in my wing of the house were replaced with thick, plastic tumblers. The official reason, delivered by the head housekeeper with downcast eyes, was for safety. My safety. As if at 70, I had suddenly become a toddler who couldn't be trusted with glass. My television was programmed to receive only 2 channels, the 24-hour news and a financial network. The others were locked, requiring a password I wasn't given. Richard said it was to keep my mind sharp and not muddled with nonsense. My life was being curated, controlled, and contracted into a small, safe, and utterly joyless box. Every day was a new small death, a fresh nick on my soul. I was being hollowed out one spoonful at a time, and I was letting it happen, my silence my only shield, a shield that was growing heavier by the day. The discovery, when it came, was not a sudden shock but the final brutal confirmation of a truth I had been trying to ignore. It happened on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. The house was quiet, Richard was at the office, and I was searching for an old family recipe on our shared cloud drive. It was my mother's recipe for apple pie, the one I'd made for Richard on our 3rd date. I typed grandma's pie into the search bar. The recipe didn't come up. Instead, a folder I didn't recognize appeared. It was simply titled Us. My heart began to beat a little faster. Curiosity, a dangerous and long-dormant emotion, pricked at me. Clicked it. The folder opened and the world fell away. There were hundreds of photos. Hundreds. And they weren't just photos. They were meticulously organized into subfolders. Street Barts. Aspen. The yacht. Home. My breath caught in my throat. I clicked on home. The first image was of her, Amber, lying in our bed. My bed. On my pillows, the ones with the monogrammed CS, that I had spent a month embroidering by hand. She was wearing one of Richard's dress shirts and nothing else, smiling at the camera with a look of smug ownership. He wasn't just cheating. He was documenting the systematic replacement of my life. I scrolled, my hand shaking so violently I could barely control the mouse. There they were, on our yacht, the Serenity, its name a bitter irony now. She was at the helm, wearing my favorite sun hat, the one I thought I had lost last summer. Another photo showed them at Per Se, one of New York's most exclusive restaurants. They were seated at our table, the one we always requested, by the window. My chair. She was sitting in my chair, raising a glass of champagne, the city lights twinkling behind her like a scene from a movie in which I had been recast. He was too arrogant, too utterly convinced of his own power, to even try to hide it. This wasn't a secret folder buried deep in a hidden drive. It was sitting right there, in our shared family cloud, next to folders labeled Michael's graduation and family vacations. It was a declaration. He wasn't just having an affair. He was erasing me. Each photo was a meticulous recreation of my life, with a younger, shinier model swapped in. There were pictures of her in my garden, holding the roses I had cultivated for 20 years. A picture of her wearing the emerald necklace Richard had given me for our 40th anniversary. A picture of them with my dog, Buster, who now slept at the foot of her bed in my old room. I felt a wave of nausea so profound I had to grip the edge of the desk. He hadn't just moved me to the guest wing. He had moved my entire existence into storage, piece by piece, memory by memory. The digital images on the screen were not just ghosts of his infidelity. They were ghosts of a life that was no longer mine, a haunting preview of my own extinction. I sat there for hours, clicking through the evidence of my own erasure, the rhythmic click of the mouse the only sound in the room, like a clock ticking down the final seconds of my 50-year marriage. The deepest wound, the one that festered and refused to heal, was not inflicted by Richard, but by my own flesh and blood. My son, Michael. After sitting with the digital evidence for a week, my insides twisted into a knot of grief and rage. I knew I had to speak to him. I needed an ally, a witness, someone to tell me I wasn't crazy. I drove to his home, a sprawling modern house his father had paid for, and found him in his home office staring at a stock ticker. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I slid my tablet onto his desk, the screen illuminated with a picture of his father and Amber, entwined on the sofa in our living room. "I know, Michael," I said, my voice barely a whisper. He didn't look shocked. He didn't even flinch. He simply glanced at the screen, then back at his stock ticker, and let out a long, weary sigh, as if I were a business deal that had gone sour. "I was wondering when you'd figure it out," he said, his tone flat, devoid of any emotion. The casualness of his admission struck me like a physical blow. "You knew?" I asked, the words catching in my throat. "You knew about this?" He swiveled in his chair to face me, his expression one of mild irritation. "Mom, look," he began, adopting the patient tone one uses with a difficult child. "Dad, he hasn't been happy for a long time. Amber makes him happy. He feels young again." I stared at him, my own son, trying to find a flicker of the boy I had raised, the one who used to run to me when he was hurt. I saw nothing but a stranger, a smaller, colder version of his father. I showed him another piece of evidence, a text chain I had found on the family phone plan. It was between him and his father. A message from Richard. "Your mother is asking where I was last night. Cover for me." Michael's reply. "No problem, Dad. I'll tell her you were at the club with me. We were talking strategy. She'll buy it." It was dated 3 months ago. He hadn't just known. He had been an active accomplice. He had looked me in the eye that morning and lied, telling me about the fictional business strategy he and his father had supposedly discussed late into the night. When I confronted him with the text, he just shrugged. "I was just trying to keep the peace," he said defensively. "What was I supposed to do? Blow everything up? You were supposed to be my son." The words burst out of me, a raw, ragged cry. "You were supposed to have a conscience." For the first time, he looked directly at me, and what I saw in his eyes broke the last remaining piece of my heart. It wasn't malice. It was something worse. Cold, calculating pragmatism. "Mom," he said, leaning forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Think about this. Dad is in charge of everything. The money, the houses, the trusts. My trust. Your lifestyle. Don't rock the boat. You have a comfortable life. Is it really worth throwing all that away just because his affections have shifted? A comfortable life." He said it so simply, as if he were discussing a line item on a spreadsheet. He didn't see a heartbroken woman, a betrayed wife, his mother. He saw an expense, a liability that needed to be managed. He saw my 50 years of love and sacrifice not as the foundation of his entire world, but as a long-term investment that had matured and was no longer providing the necessary returns. In that moment, I understood. I was not a person to him anymore. I was a part of the architecture, a feature of the estate that had to be maintained for the sake of appearances, but which could no longer be allowed to interfere with the chairman's happiness. The ultimate betrayal wasn't the affair. It was this. It was sitting in my son's sterile office and realizing that to him, my pain was just a potential disruption to the cash flow. I stood up, the tablet feeling like a slab of stone in my hands. I didn't say another word. I walked out of his house, leaving my son to his stock tickers, and for the first time I felt utterly, completely alone. The pain was no longer a collection of cuts. It was a gaping wound, and I knew with a chilling certainty that I was the only one who could stitch it closed. The drive to the hotel felt like a journey through someone else's life. The city lights blurred into streaks of indifferent color, a smear of neon and taillights painting the rain-slicked glass. Each drop that slid down the window felt like a tear. I was too numb to cry. I had checked into a suite under a name I hadn't used in 50 years. My maiden name. Camila Dubois. It felt strange on my tongue. A ghost of a girl I barely remembered. The room was sterile and personal. A beige and chrome box that perfectly mirrored the emptiness inside me. I sat on the edge of the king-sized bed, the silence of the room a roaring pressure in my ears, a stark contrast to the cacophony of the restaurant. The laughter, the gasps, Amber's high-pitched, mocking voice, the relentless clicking of her phone's camera. In that hollow quiet, my mind, seeking an anchor in the storm, drifted back. Not to my children, not to the homes I had built, but to a man I had lost long ago. My father. The memory surfaced, unbidden but sharp as fractured glass, from a time when my world was full of promise. It was the day before my wedding. The air in his study was thick with the scent of old leather, pipe tobacco, and the faint acidic smell of aging paper. Sunlight, heavy with dust motes, slanted through the tall window, illuminating his stern, judicial face. He wasn't smiling. He rarely did. He was Judge Dubois, a man who dealt in consequences, not congratulations. He pulled me aside, away from the flurry of my mother and sisters arranging flowers and fussing over my dress. His hand on my arm was firm, grounding. "Camila," he said, his voice a low rumble that always commanded attention. He didn't waste words on pleasantries. He gestured to his mahogany desk, where a thick, leather-bound folder sat, looking ancient and ominous. It was dark, a deep oxblood red with no markings on the cover. "This," he said, his eyes locking onto mine, "is for you." I reached for it, a nervous smile on my lips, assuming it was some sentimental family heirloom. His fingers clamped down on it before I could touch it. "You will not open it. You will not ask what is inside it. You will take this folder, put it somewhere safe where no one, especially not Richard, will ever find it. You will live your life as if it doesn't exist." His intensity was frightening. It was a side of him I usually only saw in newspaper clippings about his courtroom summations. "Papa, what is it?" I asked, my voice a whisper. He ignored my question, his gaze unwavering. You will live a good life with that man. You will be a good wife. You will build a family. But listen to me very carefully, daughter. He leaned closer, his voice dropping even lower. A gravelly secret just for me. The day will come, maybe tomorrow, maybe in 50 years, when he does something that makes you feel worthless. The day he makes you feel like an item in his inventory, a line item on a budget, an inconvenience to be managed. On that day, and only on that day, you will take out this piece of paper. He slid a small, crisp card from his waistcoat pocket. On it, in his severe, angular handwriting, was a phone number and the name of a law firm. Davies, Davies and Finch. You will call this number, he commanded. You will not call me. You will not call your mother. You will call this number and you will do exactly as they say. Do you understand me, Camilla? I nodded, my throat tight. I was a 20-year-old girl in love, on the cusp of what I believed would be a fairy tale. His words were a dark cloud in my perfect blue sky. I didn't understand the gravity, not really. I thought it was just my father, the cautious judge, seeing potential threats in every shadow. I took the folder and the card, and as he instructed, I buried them. The folder went into a safe deposit box I opened under my maiden name. A box Richard never knew existed. The card went into the lining of an old jewelry box. I did as he asked. I lived my life as if they didn't exist. For 50 years they didn't. Until tonight. Sitting on that hotel bed, the ghost of my father's voice was clearer than the ringing in my ears. The day he makes you feel worthless. He hadn't just made me feel worthless. He had broadcast my worthlessness to the world, complete with a cruel social media filter to accentuate my age and humiliation. The next morning my hands trembled as I dialed the number. My reflection in the dark screen of the phone was a stranger, a pale 70-year-old woman with fear in her eyes. The firm, I learned, was now run by the son of the original lawyer my father had known. Mr. Davies Jr. agreed to see me immediately, his voice conveying a professional urgency that was both comforting and terrifying. His office was the opposite of my father's. It was a cathedral of modern minimalism, glass, steel, and stark white walls overlooking the city from the 40th floor. Mr. Davies was a man in his late 50s, impeccably dressed, with a calm, analytical demeanor that radiated competence. He listened without interruption as I recounted the events of the previous night, my voice cracking only once when I described the look on my son Michael's face. He listened to the story of the last few years, the gradual dismissals, the emotional cruelty, the discovery of the affair on our shared cloud account. Finally, I told him about the folder in my safe deposit box. His composure shifted. A flicker of something, intrigue, perhaps even respect, crossed his face. Your father was a very shrewd man, Mrs. Sterling, he said, leaning forward. May I see it? An hour later, the oxblood leather folder sat on his glass desk, a relic from another era. He handled it with a reverence that surprised me, using a letter opener to carefully slice the wax seal my father had pressed into it 5 decades ago. Inside was a single thick document bound by a blue legal ribbon, a prenuptial agreement. Mr. Davies spent the next 30 minutes reading, his eyes scanning the dense, typewritten pages. The silence in the room stretched, taut and thin. I watched his face for any sign, any hint of hope. When he finally looked up, his expression was grim. He took off his glasses and polished them slowly, a gesture I recognized as a lawyer buying time to formulate a difficult truth. Camilla, he began, the use of my first name a sign of the difficult conversation to come. This document is extraordinary. Your father's foresight was remarkable. However, the word hung in the air between us, heavy and full of dread. We have a problem. A series of them, in fact. Richard's legal team is a fortress. They are the best, most ruthless corporate litigators money can buy. The moment we file, they will come at you with everything they have. He stood up and began to pace, his sleek Italian shoes silent on the polished concrete floor. First, they will attack this document. They will claim it's coercive, archaic, a relic from a time with different legal standards. They will argue that you signed it under duress, under the influence of your powerful father. They will try to have it invalidated. But my father was a judge, I said, my voice small. He would have made sure it was ironclad. He did, Davies agreed. But that won't stop them from trying. They don't have to win on that point, they just have to create doubt. Their primary strategy will be to bury us. They will file hundreds of motions. They will demand decades of financial records, personal diaries, medical histories. They will depose your friends, your children, the staff. They will bleed you dry, not just financially but emotionally. They will drag this out for years, hoping you'll break and accept a pittance to make it stop. He paused, his back to me as he looked out at the sprawling city. And then they will attack you. He turned to face me, his eyes filled with a weary sympathy. I need you to be prepared for this, Camila. They will paint you as a bitter, scorned woman. They will leak stories to the press. Given your age, they will almost certainly try to have you declared mentally incompetent. They'll claim you're senile, confused, being manipulated by me or your daughter, if she sides with you. They will twist your 50 years of devotion into a narrative of a gold-digging wife who was never satisfied. They will try to destroy your reputation and your sanity. A cold dread, heavier than any I had felt before, settled in my bones. This wasn't a battle. It was a war of attrition, and I was the battlefield. I felt my resolve, so fierce just hours before, begin to crumble. He saw it in my face. This is their playbook, he said softly. It's designed to intimidate. It's the first wall we have to be prepared to scale. The second wall appeared a few days later, and it was one of my own making. I had moved into a small furnished apartment Davies had arranged for me. It was anonymous, safe, and profoundly lonely. I spent my days in a haze of legal paperwork and sleepless nights. One evening, while searching for an old bank statement in a box of papers I'd managed to retrieve from the house, a small folded piece of notepaper fell out. It was a list of questions I had jotted down for Davies after our first meeting. Questions about asset division, timelines, potential tax implications. I didn't hear him come in. The doorman, a man who had worked for us for 20 years, must have let him up without a second thought. The first I knew of his presence was the scent of his cologne, the same sandalwood he'd worn for 30 years, and his voice thick with a feigned sorrowful concern. Camila? What is all this? I looked up, startled, to see Richard standing in the doorway of my temporary living room. He looked tired, his expensive suit slightly rumpled. He held a bouquet of my favorite lilies, now looking like a funeral arrangement. His eyes fell on the legal note in my hand. His face, which had been a mask of rage and contempt at the restaurant, crumpled into a mask of theatrical pain. He crossed the room in 2 strides, sinking to his knees in front of me. The gesture was so dramatic, so unlike him, that it momentarily stunned me. He took my hands in his. They were cold. My love, what have you done? He whispered, his voice choked with emotion. He gestured at the boxes of my life, packed away like refuse. This isn't you. This isn't us. I saw the legal note. Are you really talking to lawyers? He started to cry. Not silent, dignified tears, but great gulping sobs that shook his entire body. It was a performance, I knew it on some rational level, but 50 years of instinct to comfort this man rose up in me like a tide. Richie, I started, the old pet name slipping out. Don't, he begged, pressing my hands to his wet cheek. Don't let them do this to us. Amber, she was a mistake. A stupid, pathetic mistake. A symptom of my fear. My fear of getting old, of becoming irrelevant. You know me, Cammy. You know my ego. It was a moment of madness. It meant nothing. He looked up at me, his eyes pleading, expertly simulating a broken heart. 50 years, Camila. We built an empire. We built a family. Our children. Our grandchildren. Are you going to throw all of that away because of one foolish old man's mistake? She's gone. I sent her away. Just you. It's always been just you. He saw the hesitation in my eyes, the flicker of doubt, and he went in for the kill. Don't you see what they're doing? He said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. These lawyers, they smell money. They are vultures trying to pick apart the corpse of our marriage. They will take everything, Cammy. They will turn us against each other, turn the children against you. Is that what you want for our family? A public spectacle? A war? For a moment I wavered. He was right. Was I about to destroy my family over his infidelity? Was my pride worth the pain it would cause everyone? The memories flooded back. The early years when we had nothing but each other. The births of our children. The triumphs we had celebrated. The tragedies we had weathered. This man on his knees before me was the architect of my entire adult life. Could I really be the one to detonate the bomb that would level it all? That was his goal. To make me doubt my own righteous anger. To make me the villain of my own story. To make me feel guilty for fighting back. The gaslighting was so powerful, so deeply rooted in half a century of shared history, that it almost worked. He almost had me. He would have if he hadn't made one small mistake. As he held my hands, his thumb stroked the back of mine and I saw it. On his wrist, peeking out from under the cuff of his $1,000 shirt, was the thin, braided leather bracelet I had seen in the photos on the cloud. A cheap bohemian trinket. Amber had been wearing a matching one in a picture of them on the yacht in Monaco. He hadn't sent her away. He had probably just dropped her off at a spa for the afternoon before coming here to play the part of the repentant husband. The illusion shattered. The 50 years of memories receded, replaced by the cold, hard clarity of his lie. I pulled my hands away. His performance faltered, the tears instantly drying up as a flicker of annoyance crossed his face. He had failed. "You should go, Richard," I said, my voice as cold and sterile as the room around me. The third wall was the highest and most formidable. My own son, Michael. After Richard's failed attempt at reconciliation, the lawyer's assault began, just as Davies had predicted. The first salvo was a formal petition, filed on Richard's behalf, to challenge my legal rights on the grounds of diminished mental capacity. It was filled with humiliating, fabricated anecdotes. It claimed I was forgetful, paranoid, prone to fits of rage. The most cutting part was the sworn affidavit attached in support of the petition. It was signed by my son, Michael. He had sided with his father, attesting that my behavior had become erratic and concerning over the past year. He was helping his father build the narrative that I was a crazy old woman who needed to be controlled. The betrayal was a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. This was worse than Richard's affair. This was a child, my child, trying to strip me of my autonomy and my dignity for money. Davies was furious but pragmatic. "This is bad, Camila. A child testifying against a parent carries immense weight. We have to fight it, but it complicates everything." He explained that to counter it, we needed our own evidence, our own witnesses. We needed people to attest to my lucidity and strength. I thought of my daughter Sarah, who lived in London. She had always been closer to me, but she was gentle, easily intimidated. I was reluctant to drag her into such a vicious fight. I thought of old friends, but how many of them would be willing to publicly defy a man as powerful and vindictive as Richard Sterling? My world had been his world for so long. Our friends were his friends. Our social circle was his court. The sense of isolation was absolute. I was an army of one against a legion. It felt hopeless. I sat in Davies' office, the cruel words of my son's affidavit burning in my mind, and I felt the fight drain out of me. Maybe they were right. Maybe it was better to just walk away, take whatever scraps Richard offered, and live out my remaining years in quiet obscurity. "Don't let them win, Camila," Davies said, his voice firm. "Your father didn't build this fortress for you to surrender at the first cannon shot." He gestured to the prenup, which was now kept in his office safe. "There's something about this document. It's more than just a contract. It's a weapon. And I have a feeling we haven't yet figured out how to properly arm it." His words sparked a tiny ember in the ashes of my resolve. He was right. My father, the judge, had not been a sentimental man. He hadn't given me that folder to protect my feelings. He had given it to me to protect my life. And there was something about his warning, a coldness that went beyond simple paternal caution, that I had never understood. That night, unable to sleep, I was looking through the original file Davies had given me a copy of. It contained the prenup and my father's cover letter to his lawyer, the original Mr. Davies. It was mostly standard legal language, but one sentence caught my eye. Please file the attached under the associated case file H74-328. Seemed innocuous, but as I stared at it, a memory stirred. My father's filing system. As a child, I had sometimes helped his clerk organize old papers. Civil cases were marked with a C, family court with an F, corporate with a corp. H. I racked my brain. H was for homicide and serious felonies. My heart began to pound. It made no sense. Why would a prenuptial agreement be associated with a criminal file? I called Davies at home, my voice shaking. I think I found something. It took Davies 2 days of pulling strings and calling in favors with old court clerks, but he finally got access to the sealed file. He called me into his office. The look on his face was one of profound shock. He slid a dusty, forgotten-looking file across the glass desk. The file number matched. H74-328. "This is why your father insisted," he said, his voice hushed with disbelief. "This is the secret." I opened the folder. Inside were not legal briefs, but police reports, witness statements, and yellowed newspaper clippings. The story they told turned my blood to ice. In the year before he met me, Richard Sterling was not the struggling, ambitious tech visionary he had claimed to be. He was a grifter, a con man, and he was the primary suspect in a criminal investigation. He had targeted wealthy, elderly widows. 2 of them. He had charmed his way into their lives and then systematically defrauded them of their life savings. One of the women had died of a heart attack shortly after discovering she was penniless. Her family suspected it was brought on by the stress and heartbreak, but couldn't prove it. The other was about to press charges when suddenly the investigation was dropped. All the evidence was sealed. The case simply vanished. The reason it vanished was detailed in a final, confidential memo in the file, written by the district attorney to my father. My father had discovered the investigation while doing a routine background check on the young man his daughter had fallen in love with. To save me, to save our family, from the public shame and humiliation of a scandal, Judge Du Bois had used his immense influence to have the investigation quietly buried. He had made the evidence disappear. But he had not let the wolf go free. He had made a deal. In exchange for his freedom and a clean slate, Richard would sign the prenuptial agreement my father had drafted. It wasn't a contract. It was a cage. My father had let the wolf into my life, but he had built an inescapable trap around him, a trap whose trigger was tied to the very core of Richard's predatory nature, his ego and his cruelty. The prenup wasn't just about money. It was a life sentence held in abeyance. It was a weapon of mutually assured destruction that only I could fire. And the rage, the betrayal, the slandering, the gaslighting, all of it was all just Richard, the same con man from 50 years ago, trying to work his last and greatest con. And in that moment, I knew with chilling certainty that the doubt, the fear, the hesitation, it was all gone. All that was left was the cold, clear duty of pulling the trigger. The air in our home, once a space of shared history, had become thick with the cloying sweetness of Richard's performance. After his theatrical breakdown in my study, the one where he'd discovered my note from Mr. Davies and manufactured tears of repentance, he had transformed. He became the doting husband, a caricature of the man I had once loved. He brought me breakfast in bed, trays laden with foods I hadn't enjoyed in 20 years. His memory of me as outdated as his understanding of my spirit. He'd kiss my forehead, his lips cold and dry against my skin, and tell me how he'd been lost, how the stress of the business had made him a monster, but that he was back now. He was my Richard again. I played my part with the quiet dedication of a seasoned actress. I was the fragile wife, shaken by his near straying, grateful for his return to the fold. I let my hands tremble slightly when I poured his coffee. I'd forget where I put my reading glasses, allowing him the small, satisfying victory of finding them for me. I was a ghost in my own life, a symphony of sighs and soft, forgiving smiles. Every gesture of his contrived affection was a stone I placed on the scales of justice. Every lie a nail in the coffin he was unknowingly building for himself. He saw a wilting flower, too frail and too dependent to ever survive without him. He didn't see the roots, deep and tenacious, drawing strength from a well of righteous fury. he could never comprehend. One morning, as he was detailing his upcoming business trip to Geneva, a trip I knew involved a 5-star suite at the Mandarin Oriental and a 24-year-old brunette named Amber, I chose my moment. He was boasting about a new acquisition, his voice booming with the self-congratulatory tone that had become his default. I looked up from my tablet, my face a mask of carefully constructed confusion. "Richard, darling," I began, my voice soft and wavering. "I'm having the most dreadful time with all this online banking. It's all so technical. The passwords, the two-factor things. I just can't seem to get the hang of it." He stopped, a condescending smirk playing on his lips. "It's not that hard, Camila. You just need to pay attention." "I know, I try," I said, looking down at my hands as if ashamed of my own incompetence. "It's just I feel so silly asking the staff for a bit of cash every time I need to buy something for the garden or pick up a gift for one of the charity ladies. It makes me feel like a child." I let a single perfect tear well in the corner of my eye. It was a masterful touch, if I did say so myself. His chest puffed out. This was a role he loved. The magnanimous patriarch, the benevolent provider for his simple-minded wife. "Oh, sweetheart, don't be upset. It's no problem at all." He reached into his wallet, a sleek black alligator skin monstrosity, and pulled out a credit card. He paused, then put it back. Of course, an Amex Centurion card had no spending limit. He wasn't that foolish. Instead, he opened a drawer in the kitchen island, a place filled with odds and ends, and produced a different card. It was a simple debit card from a secondary bank, the kind you give to a teenager. "Here," he said, sliding it across the marble countertop. "I'll put some money in this for you. A little allowance so you don't have to worry your pretty little head about all those complicated apps." He chuckled, a low rumbling sound that grated on my nerves like scraping metal. "Let's say $500 a week? That should be plenty for your flowers and little trinkets, shouldn't it?" I picked up the card. It felt flimsy and cheap, a piece of blue plastic that perfectly symbolized what he thought I was worth. $500. After 50 years of building his empire with my inheritance, my intellect, and my lifeblood, my value had been assessed at $500. I looked at him, my eyes wide with feigned gratitude. "Oh, Richard. Thank you. This is perfect. You're so good to me." He beamed, leaning over to kiss my cheek. "Of course I am. I just want my girl to be happy." He patted my head, a gesture one might use on a well-behaved dog. He thought he had one. He thought he had placated the dotty old woman, tidied up the loose end, and purchased my silence for the price of a mid-range dinner. He had no idea he had just handed me the final piece of my disguise, the cloak of perceived helplessness. I was no longer just the forgotten wife. I was the forgetful, technologically illiterate, allowance-receiving wife. I was utterly, completely, and perfectly underestimated. And in his world of monstrous egos and blatant power plays, to be underestimated was to be invisible. To be invisible was to be invincible. The moment the front door clicked shut, signaling the departure of Richard and his driver for the airport, the house transformed. The air, heavy with his arrogance and my pretense, seemed to clear. The quiet was no longer a sign of absence but a canvas for my work. I stood in the grand foyer, listening to the engine of his Maybach fade into the distance. The woman who had been smiling gratefully at a plastic debit card just hours before was gone. In her place stood a strategist, a forensic accountant, and a woman on the verge of reclaiming her life. My first act was to change. I shed the soft cashmere twin set and sensible pearls, my uniform of the docile wife, and put on a tailored gray suit. The crisp fabric felt like armor. My second act was to make a call. Not to a friend, not to a spa, but to the discreet car service I had engaged weeks ago. A black town car, indistinguishable from the dozens that populated our exclusive neighborhood, arrived at a side gate precisely 10 minutes later. I walked out carrying a locked briefcase, my posture erect, my steps purposeful. The drive to downtown was a blur of glass and steel, a world away from the manicured lawns and feigned civility of my gilded cage. Mr. Davies's law firm, Sterling, Davies & Thorne, was housed in a pre-war building of granite and brass. It was a place that spoke of old money, older secrets, and unshakable discretion. The name on the door was no coincidence. My father, the judge, had been the founding Sterling. He had chosen Mr. Davies, then a brilliant young associate, to be his protégé, trusting him with the firm's legacy and, as it turned out, with my future. I was not announced. I had a key card that granted me access to a private elevator that opened directly into a secure wing of the top floor. This was not a client meeting. This was a war council. The space we used was a stark contrast to the firm's opulent lobby. It was a document room, windowless and climate-controlled, filled with gray metal shelves and archival boxes. In the center was a large conference table and a suite of high-end computers. This was my war room. Mr. Davies was already there, a man whose quiet demeanor concealed a mind as sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. He was in his late 60s with kind eyes that missed nothing. He nodded as I entered, a silent gesture of respect and readiness. "Camilla," he said, his voice a calm anchor in my turbulent world. "He's on his way? Wheels up in 45 minutes, I replied, placing my briefcase on the table and clicking it open. Destination Geneva. Passenger manifest includes one Amber Du Bois, age 24, occupation listed as influencer. A younger associate, a bright-eyed woman named Sarah who specialized in digital forensics, handed me a tablet. "We've confirmed the booking at the Mandarin Oriental Presidential Suite, paid for by a corporate account for Sterling Innovations International, a subsidiary registered in the Cayman Islands." I looked at the confirmation on the screen. The casual profligacy of it was staggering. This one trip would cost more than my father had made in a year on the bench. "Add it to the list," I said, my voice cold and even. And so our work began. While Richard was sipping champagne at 30,000 feet with his mistress, I was descending into the labyrinth of his financial empire. For the past few weeks, ever since Richard's fake apology had bought me this precious time, every day he was away on a business trip was a day spent here, in this room, meticulously deconstructing the life he had built on my foundations. We started with the physical documents my father had preserved. Ledgers, incorporation papers, original investment agreements written on my own personal stationery, all bearing my signature next to Richard's. These were the cornerstones, the proof that my inheritance wasn't a gift, but the seed capital from which everything grew. Then we moved to the present. Mr. Davies's team had legally and discreetly obtained decades of financial records. Every tax return, every bank statement, every wire transfer. My past life as a forensic accountant, a career I had abandoned for marriage, came roaring back. The skills were dormant, not dead. My days became a blur of numbers and names. I traced my initial investment of $250,000, a fortune in those days, as it blossomed. I followed it as it was funneled from our first company, Sterling Miller Tech, into a new entity called Miller Innovations. My name Sterling had been the first thing to be erased. From there, the money multiplied and fractured, flowing into a dizzying array of shell corporations, offshore accounts, and holding companies with deliberately opaque names like Orion Holdings and Apex Ventures. "He's good, I'll give him that," I muttered one afternoon, staring at a flowchart on the wall that looked like a spider's web spun by a madman. "He's layered these companies like a Russian doll. Each one owns another, obscuring the source of the funds." "He learned from the best," Mr. Davies said gently, pointing to a file from the early days. "The men he swindled before he met you, they taught him how to hide assets. Your father knew he had that capacity for deceit. It's why he insisted on the prenup." The prenup. It was our map, our charter, our weapon. We had a copy enlarged and mounted on the wall, and my eyes were drawn to it 100 times a day. Most of it was standard boilerplate language. But then there was Clause 7. My father, in his infinite wisdom and deep-seated suspicion of the man his daughter loved, had insisted on it. Richard, blinded by arrogance and the belief that he would never be foolish enough to get caught, had signed it without a fuss. Mr. Davies had nicknamed it the Sovereignty Clause. It was a masterpiece of legal language, both elegant and brutal. It stated in no uncertain terms that should Richard Sterling engage in any act of public humiliation directed at his wife, Camilla Sterling, Or should irrefutable proof of marital infidelity be established, the contract would be considered fundamentally breached. Upon such a breach, the division of assets would not be the standard 50-50. Instead, the clause triggered a full reversion. All marital assets, defined as any wealth, property, or corporate entity acquired after the date of the wedding, and any assets derived from them, would revert to the sole and exclusive ownership of the non-breaching party. In this case, me. It was not a divorce settlement. It was a detonator. He created a structure to hide his assets from the IRS, from potential business litigants, Sarah explained, her fingers flying across a keyboard as she traced a digital money trail from a holding company in Delaware to a bank in Zurich. But by doing so, he tied everything together. Every company, every property, every stock portfolio, it all originated from that first one. It all grew from your money. The clause doesn't just give you the house and half the stocks, Camila. It gives you everything. The web he wove to protect his money is the very thing that will trap him. I spent hours poring over Richard's digital life. We had ethical, legal access to the shared cloud accounts he had been too lazy and arrogant to secure. I saw it all. The photographs with Amber on my yacht, the one I had named the Serene, the receipts for jewelry from Cartier and Graff, charged to business accounts as client gifts, the airline tickets, the hotel bills, the smirking selfies of them clinking champagne glasses in places he had once taken me, places that were supposed to be ours. Each image, each receipt was a stab of pain. It was the digital ghost of 1,000 tiny cuts. But I didn't allow myself to cry. I didn't allow myself to rage. I took each piece of evidence, each confirmation of his betrayal, and I cataloged it. I saved it to a triple encrypted hard drive. I treated it not as a personal wound, but as ammunition. The pain was fuel. It kept me going late into the night, long after Mr. Davies and his team had gone home, leaving me alone in the silent war room with the ghosts of my marriage. The hardest part was returning home. I would leave the cold, clinical world of legal strategy and step back into the role of the fragile wife. Richard would return from his trips, tanned and invigorated, bearing a token gift, a scarf from Hermes, a box of Swiss chocolates. He'd tell me stories of boring board meetings and stuffy European bankers, and I would listen, nodding and smiling, my mind still tracing the wire transfer he'd made from Zurich to a jeweler in Monaco 3 days prior. One evening he came home early. I was in my study, a single spreadsheet open on my laptop, a detailed breakdown of his personal stock portfolio. I heard the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway and my heart seized. I slammed the laptop shut just as I heard his keys in the door. My hands were shaking. I took a deep breath, smoothed my hair, and composed my face into a look of pleasant surprise. He walked in, smelling of stale airplane air and expensive cologne. Decided to catch an earlier flight. Missed you, he lied, leaning in to kiss me. What a lovely surprise, I lied back. How was the conference? Exhausting. Same old, same old. He glanced at my closed laptop. Working on your charity budgets? Something like that. I said, my voice airy and light. Just trying to make the numbers make sense. It's all so confusing. He laughed, that same condescending chuckle. Don't you worry about it. If you get in a pinch, just use that little card I gave you. There's plenty there for your bake sales. I smiled. You're right, of course. I don't know why I bother trying to understand it. He patted my shoulder and walked out, heading for the bar to pour himself a scotch. I sank back into my chair, my heart pounding. The mask had almost slipped. The risk was immense, but so was the prize. It was more than just the money. It was the reclamation of my life, my name, my contribution. He hadn't just cheated on me. He had tried to erase me, to reduce 50 years of partnership to a footnote in his biography, to a $500 weekly allowance. The final days of preparation were the most intense. We had everything. A mountain of evidence. Financial charts that proved every dollar in his empire was fruit from the poisonous tree of his deceit, grown from the seed of my inheritance. We had sworn affidavits from yacht staff who had been forced to cater to Amber. We had digital receipts for every illicit tryst. And we had the live stream from that night at the restaurant, the public humiliation, saved on a dozen different servers, the ultimate, undeniable trigger for Clause 7. On the last day, before Richard was due back from his final trip, Mr. Davies and I stood alone in the war room. The walls were covered in charts and timelines. The table was clear except for one document, the original prenuptial agreement, its pages yellowed with age, my father's signature bold and clear at the bottom. Mr. Davies placed a hand on the document. It's all in place, Camilla. We have a team of process servers ready. We have communications drafted for the boards of every company. The moment the clause is invoked, we can execute a complete asset freeze and transfer of ownership within minutes. His corporate access, his bank accounts, his credit lines, they will all cease to exist. I looked at the document, at my own youthful signature beside Richard's. I had been so in love, so blind to the warnings in my own father's eyes. I hadn't understood the cage he was building, not for me, but for the wolf he knew he was letting into my life. He believes I am planning a quiet, dignified divorce, I said, more to myself than to Mr. Davies. He expects me to negotiate for the house, a modest pension. He thinks my greatest weapon is a good lawyer. He's about to find out, Mr. Davies said, his voice grim, that your greatest weapon was a good father. I nodded, a cold resolve settling deep in my bones. The time for strategy was over. The time for sentiment was long past. I was no longer playing the part of the forgetful wife. I was stepping onto the stage for the final act, not as a victim, but as the director of his downfall. The war room had served its purpose. Now it was time to go to the theater that I orchestrated the anniversary dinner. Every last detail was my design. A stage set for a tragedy that only one person in the room knew was actually a coronation. I suggested per se a place so ostentatiously expensive, so dripping with the kind of prestige Richard used as a substitute for a personality, that I knew he couldn't resist. It was the perfect backdrop for the performance of a lifetime, his and mine. He thought the evening was about celebrating 50 years of his success, with me as a faded, silent accessory. In reality, it was about celebrating the end of his 50-year reign. I knew he would bring Amber. His ego, a fragile and ravenous beast, demanded an audience for my public execution. He couldn't just discard me. He had to pulverize me to show the world and himself how thoroughly he had won. He needed a witness to validate his power, and a 24-year-old with a live TikTok feed was the ultimate modern trophy. So I gave him one. I made it easy. When he'd asked where we should go, I'd feigned forgetfulness, a gentle confusion. Oh, Richard, you decide. Wherever you think is best. I knew that giving him the illusion of control was the surest way to guide his hand. He chose per se within the hour. The trap was set. The bait was his own reflection. Now, sitting across from him, the ghost of a 9-course meal lay between us. My plate was barely touched. The food, no matter how exquisite, tasted like ash. I watched him, this man I had known for half a century, as he preened for Amber's phone. He was a performer, energized by the little red light that signified he was live, that thousands of strangers were watching him discard his old life like a soiled napkin. He held his champagne flute aloft, the crystal catching the light, and his voice boomed with false sentimentality. 50 years. He declared to the phone, and then as an afterthought to me. A lifetime. And for your service, Camilla, I am grateful. The word service was delivered with the same tone one might use for a long-serving, but ultimately replaceable housekeeper. Amber giggled, a sound like tiny shards of glass. She adjusted the phone, making sure to get me in the frame. Show them the gift, babe. Show everyone how generous you are. Richard's smile widened. It didn't reach his eyes. They were cold, flat stones. He slid the black Amex card across the polished mahogany table. This should cover your transition. Find a nice, quiet little apartment. My assistants have already arranged for your things to be moved to a storage unit. They'll be in touch. The words were meant to be the final blows. The public dismissal. The confirmation of my irrelevance. I was no longer a wife, a partner, the co-founder of his empire. I was an expense to be managed, a piece of furniture to be stored. I looked at the card, a slab of black plastic that was supposed to represent my severance package for 50 years of my life. I didn't touch it. Amber leaned in, her phone aimed directly at my face. Say something, Camila. The people want to know how you feel. Are you sad? Grateful? Smile for the camera. A cruel filter flickered over my face on her screen. A caricature with exaggerated tears and a downturned mouth. I could hear the faint, tinny sound of comments scrolling, of laughing emojis popping up in a digital stream of mockery. This was the moment, the lowest point, the precise depth of humiliation my father had warned me about, the trigger he had so presciently encoded into our lives 50 years ago. I felt a strange calm settle over me, a chilling clarity. The noise of the restaurant, the whispers from other tables, Amber's vapid commentary. It all faded into a distant hum. I looked past Richard's triumphant face, past Amber's glowing phone, toward the grand entrance of the restaurant. I had timed this. I had rehearsed this. I had lived this moment in my mind 1,000 times. Richard, I said, my voice quiet but carrying in the sudden stillness I had created. There's one more guest arriving for our anniversary. He scoffed. Don't be ridiculous. The party's over. For you at least. Now if you'll excuse me, Amber and I have a flight to catch. St. Bart's waits for no one. He made a show of looking at the diamond-encrusted Rolex on his wrist, the one I knew he'd bought with Amber in Geneva last spring, while I was at home coordinating the quarterly tax filings for his holding companies. Security will be here in 5 minutes to escort you out if you cause a scene. Don't embarrass yourself further. They're already here, I said softly. Just as the words left my lips, the heavy oak doors of Per Se swung open. The hushed elegance of the dining room was broken by a new presence. It wasn't security. It was Mr. Davies, my father's old friend and the senior partner of the law firm he had directed me to all those years ago. He was flanked by 2 associates, a man and a woman, both with expressions as hard and unyielding as granite. They moved with a silent, coordinated purpose that silenced the room. Diners paused with forks halfway to their mouths. Waitstaff froze in place. Mr. Davies was in his late 70s, but he stood as straight as a steel rod. He wore a perfectly tailored Seville row suit that probably cost more than the car Richard had just bought for his mistress. He didn't look at the gawking patrons. He didn't look at Richard, whose smug expression was beginning to curdle into confusion. He looked only at me. His eyes, clear and sharp, posed a single question across the room. Camila. His voice was calm, respectful, cutting through the silence. Is it time? I met his gaze. 50 years of slights, of being ignored, of being rendered invisible, all coalesced into this one single action. I gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was the smallest of movements, but it felt like I was shifting the tectonic plates of my entire world. Richard, seeing his carefully orchestrated drama being hijacked, let out a short, barking laugh. It was a sound brittle with insecurity. Who is this clown? He sneered, gesturing dismissively at Mr. Davies. What is this, Camila? Did you hire a community theater actor to try and scare me? Pathetic. You always were overly dramatic. He turned to Amber. Get this. She's trying to fight back. It's almost cute. Mr. Davies and his team advanced to our table. They moved not with aggression, but with an unnerving, absolute certainty. They didn't stop until they were standing beside us, casting a literal shadow over Richard's celebration. Mr. Davies placed his leather briefcase on an empty chair, the clicks of the brass latches echoing in the dead quiet room. He withdrew a single thick document. It was bound in dark, navy blue leather, the corners worn, the pages heavy with age and significance. I knew it intimately. I had read it every night for the past 6 months. He placed the leather-bound prenup on the table with a soft, definitive thud. The sound was a gavel falling. Mr. Sterling, Mr. Davies began, his tone purely informational, as if he were reading a weather report. My name is Arthur Davies. I was your father-in-law's legal counsel, and I am the executor of the contract you signed on May 4, 1974. This document. He tapped a single manicured finger on its cover. Richard stared at the document, a flicker of something, annoyance, then a dawning distant memory in his eyes. A prenup? That thing was a joke. A formality. It's meaningless after 50 years. On the contrary, Mr. Davies said, his voice dropping a fraction, becoming even colder. It is more meaningful today than ever before. I would like to draw your attention to Clause 7, subsection B. The sovereignty clause. He didn't need to open it. He knew it by heart. So did I. The clause is triggered by one of two conditions: a documented act of infidelity leading to divorce proceedings, or a willful and public act of humiliation intended to divest the spouse of her dignity and standing. He paused, letting the words sink in. He then gestured politely towards Amber's phone, which was, incredibly, still recording. This live broadcast in which you publicly terminate your marriage, announce your affair, and subject your wife to ridicule in front of a digital audience of. One of his associates glanced at her own phone and whispered, 17,000 viewers and climbing, more than satisfies the condition for willful and public humiliation. This act has been certified by my associates here, timestamped, and recorded from multiple angles. It is ironclad. Richard's face was a mask of disbelief. So what? What does some dusty old clause from the 70s mean? I'll give her a generous settlement. Now get out of my sight. A settlement will not be necessary, Mr. Davies stated, because pursuant to Clause 7, the moment the trigger condition was met and certified, a non-revocable transfer of power was initiated. As of 60 seconds ago, all assets, personal and corporate, held by Richard Sterling, Sterling Innovations, and its 37 global subsidiaries, are now frozen. A ripple of shock went through the room. Richard just stared. Amber's perfectly made-up jaw went slack. The freeze is temporary, Mr. Davies continued, his delivery utterly relentless. It is merely a precursor. The clause stipulates that upon its activation, full and uncontested ownership of all marital assets, which the contract defines as all wealth, property, and equity accumulated from the date of signing onward, is to be immediately and permanently transferred to the aggrieved party. In this case, Camilla Sterling. He looked at me, a flicker of his old friend, my father, in his eyes. Effective immediately, Mr. Sterling. Everything you think you own is now hers. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a void, a vacuum where Richard's entire world used to be. And then a new sound began. A soft electronic chime. It came from Amber's phone, which she was still holding dumbly in her hand. A notification banner slid down from the top of the screen. I could read the bold text from across the table. Citibank. Access denied. A moment later her phone buzzed again. Chase private client. Account frozen. Then came a symphony. Richard's phone, sitting on the table beside the useless Amex, began to vibrate violently. It lit up, a cascade of notifications, a digital avalanche. Wells Fargo. Security alert, access denied. E-Trade account locked. Merrill Lynch. Login disabled. Each message was a nail being hammered into the coffin of his empire. His digital identity, his entire financial existence was being systematically erased in real time. Amber let out a small strangled gasp. Her eyes, wide with a terror that was purely financial, darted from her phone to Richard's, then to my face. The influencer, the provocateur, vanished. In her place was just a panicked young woman who had suddenly realized her sugar daddy's bank account had just evaporated. The live feed, her audience, her cruel game, it was all forgotten. With a shaking hand, she fumbled with the screen and ended the broadcast. The little red light winked out. The execution was over. The audience was gone. Richard snatched his phone, his fingers stabbing at the screen. His face, which had been a healthy, arrogant tan just minutes before, was now a pasty, sickly gray. What is this? This is impossible. It's a hack. My IT team will. His voice trailed off as another notification appeared. Sterling Innovations. Your corporate administrative privileges have been revoked. He couldn't even call his own IT team. He had been locked out of his own life. Just then, a waiter who had been hovering awkwardly nearby throughout the entire exchange decided to make his move, perhaps hoping to diffuse the tension. He discreetly picked up the black Amex card from the table. Excuse me, sir, shall I take care of the bill? Richard didn't even look at him. He was still staring at his dead phone, his knuckles white. The waiter swiped the card through his handheld machine. There was a pause. A quiet, pathetic little beep. He looked at the screen, his brow furrowed in embarrassment. He cleared his throat. "I'm very sorry, sir," he mumbled. His voice barely a whisper, but it sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. "The card. It's been declined." The clatter of silverware hitting a plate was the only sound that broke the spell. It was Mr. Davies, calmly placing his fork down beside a half-eaten piece of sea bass. The sound, so small and ordinary, was like a gunshot in the tomb-like silence that had fallen over the restaurant. Richard's face, which had been a mask of triumphant cruelty just moments before, was now a canvas of slack-jawed disbelief. His eyes, wide and unblinking, were fixed on the prenuptial agreement lying on the table like a death sentence. Amber, the vapid little star of her own livestream, had frozen mid-pout, her phone still held aloft but forgotten. The glowing screen showed thousands of comments scrolling by, a digital Greek chorus witnessing the complete and utter implosion of a titan. I felt a strange calm settle over me, a tranquility that felt foreign after months of calculated rage and years of quiet desperation. The storm inside me had passed, leaving behind a clear, quiet sky. I looked at Richard, truly looked at him, not as my husband or the father of my child, but as a man. A small, arrogant man who had built his empire on my inheritance and my spirit, and who believed both were his to discard at will. He was a king who had just discovered his crown was made of paper, and his castle was built on sand. Slowly, deliberately, I pushed my chair back. The soft scrape of its legs against the polished marble floor seemed to echo in the cavernous room. Every eye was on me. The patrons at other tables, the sommelier who had frozen mid-pour, the waitstaff lined against the wall, they were all statues in my personal museum of vengeance. I reached for the bottle of 1982 Chateau Margaux, the one Richard had ordered with such a flourish, a wine that cost more than most people's monthly rent. My fingers, steady and sure, wrapped around its cool, dark glass. The weight of it felt substantial, real. I stood up, the fabric of my dress settling around me. I was no longer the frumpy, invisible wife. In that moment I felt like I was 10 feet tall, forged from the steel of 50 years of silent endurance. I looked down at Richard, whose gaze was now pleading, confused. He looked like a lost little boy. I felt nothing. No pity, no lingering affection, just the hollow echo of a love that had died long ago. I held up the bottle slightly, letting it catch the light from the crystal chandelier above. "Thank you for 50 years, Richard," I said. My voice was even, without a tremor of anger or triumph. It was the voice of a CEO closing a deal, final and absolute. "This should cover your Uber." I placed the bottle back on the table with a soft, definitive thud. I didn't wait for a response. There was nothing more to say. I turned and walked away. I didn't look at Amber, whose live stream was now likely capturing the most viral moment of her short, pathetic career. I didn't look at Mr. Davies, who gave me the slightest, most professional of nods. I didn't look at the shocked faces of the people Richard had called his friends. I walked, my heels clicking a steady, unhurried rhythm on the floor. It was the sound of shackles falling away. With every step I felt lighter. I was walking away from a life that had been a gilded cage, leaving the zookeeper trapped inside. The heavy oak doors of the restaurant opened for me, and I stepped out into the cool night air. I did not look back. I walked out of the restaurant, leaving him in a silent room full of staring faces, a king with no kingdom. The silence of that room was replaced by a different kind of quiet in the weeks that followed. It was the productive quiet of boardrooms, the focused quiet of legal offices, the peaceful quiet of a home that was finally my own. The news, of course, was loud. Tabloids had a field day. "Tech titan toppled by jilted wife," one headline screamed. "Billionaire gets wiped out by 70-year-old spouse," another blared. They painted me as a vindictive shrew, a black widow who had waited decades to strike. They didn't know the half of it. They couldn't comprehend that this wasn't about money. It was about reclaiming a life. Richard and Amber became a sad spectacle. I saw a paparazzi photo of them one afternoon while waiting for a meeting. They were coming out of a drab apartment building in a part of New Jersey I'd only ever flown over. He looked a decade older, his bespoke suit replaced by a wrinkled polo shirt, his face a mask of weary anger. Amber was clinging to his arm, her makeup-free face pale and sullen, the TikTok fame having evaporated as quickly as his fortune. They were fighting lawsuits from former partners, people who had only done business with Richard because of the stability my name and my family's reputation had provided. Now that the foundation was gone, the whole rotten structure was collapsing in on itself. Then came the call I had been expecting. I was in my new home office, a beautiful room overlooking the Pacific, signing the final transfer documents for a portfolio of properties my father had originally purchased. My phone buzzed and the name Michael flashed on the screen. My son. The child I had raised. The boy who had chosen his father's money over his mother's dignity. I let it ring for a moment, then answered, putting it on speaker. Mom. His voice was thin, strained. The usual entitled arrogance was gone, replaced by a desperate whine. Michael, I said, my voice calm, professional. I kept signing my name on the documents. Camilla Sterling. It looked so powerful on the page. Mom, I can't access my trust. The bank says there's a hold on it. They said the funds are gone. I paused my pen, looking out at the endless blue of the ocean. That's correct, I said. There was a moment of stunned silence on his end. What? What do you mean that's correct? Dad set that up for me. It's my money. No, Michael, I explained patiently, as if to a child who didn't understand a simple concept. It was your father's money. It was part of the marital assets. And the marital assets are now my assets. All of them. But that's not fair, he sputtered, his voice rising in panic. I need that money. I have bills, a mortgage, my life. Your life? I repeated softly, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. You were quite concerned about maintaining your comfortable life when you advised me to stay silent, weren't you? You told me to endure your father's affair so the family finances wouldn't be disrupted. You made your choice, Michael. You saw me not as your mother, but as a line item in your father's budget, a necessary expense for your comfort. Well, the budget has been revised. He started to sob then, messy, gulping sobs of a spoiled man-child facing his first real consequence. Please, Mom. I'm begging you. Just a little. I'm your son. I picked up my pen again and signed the last document with a flourish. I told him his father had already spent it, I said, my voice as cold and clear as the glass on my desk. You chose a side, Michael. And there are consequences for choosing the wrong side. I ended the call. I did not feel a shred of guilt. I felt a profound, aching sadness for the boy I had lost, but the man he had become was a stranger to me. He was a casualty of his own father's greed, and I was done cleaning up Richard's messes. The world called me names. On Twitter, I was a trending topic for a week. Vindictive wife. Gold digger grandma. In the financial papers, they called me ruthless. In the gossip columns, they called me a monster. They debated the morality of the prenup, the ethics of my father's foresight, the coldness of my execution. They didn't understand. They couldn't. How could they understand what it feels like to be erased bit by bit over 50 years? To have your dreams, your name, your very identity absorbed into someone else's shadow until you're not sure where he ends and you begin. But I am not a monster. I am a 70-year-old woman sitting on the deck of a yacht named the Claws. My yacht. The sun is just beginning to crest the horizon, painting the sky in strokes of rose and gold. The ocean which I now own is calm and vast. A warm breeze carries the scent of salt and freedom. In my hand is a cup of coffee, brewed exactly how I like it, not how Richard's staff was instructed to make it. I am wearing a simple linen robe. Not a designer gown chosen to complement my husband's suit. There is no one to perform for. No image to maintain. There is only me, the sky and the sea. For 50 years, I lived in a house that was never a home, slept in a bed next to a man who saw me as an asset, and answered to a name that felt more like a title, Mrs. Richard Sterling. This morning, for the first time, I feel like just Camilla. It is a name I am getting to know all over again. They can call me whatever they want. Their words are whispers on a distant shore. Because I am not a monster. I am a 70-year-old woman eating her breakfast on the deck of her yacht, watching the sunrise over the ocean she now owns. And for the first time in 50 years I am free.